I was at a restaurant a little while ago, just, waiting in line. And I had this encounter with an employee at the counter who was, well, he was practically vibrating with energy. He wasn't just polite, which, would have been totally fine. He was intensely cheerful, almost aggressively so. Every single sentence that came out of his mouth was some kind of positive exclamation. It was all this optimistic dialogue that just seemed to be, I don't know, bouncing off the walls. He's just standing there radiating this relentless joy that felt almost startling compared to the tired, just focused moods of everyone else who was just waiting for their food. But this is where it got really interesting for me. Instead of feeling uplifted by all his glee, I felt this really distinct, almost uncomfortable deer caught in the headlights sensation. I just stood there watching his performance, and I think we have to call it a performance. And I just felt completely disconnected from whatever it was he was selling. I started wondering, what is the source of this persistent, almost mandated positivity? Is it a deep-seated personal belief? Is it a work requirement?
Or is it just a complete refusal to look at anything else in the world? And it triggered this memory from when I was a kid of realizing that the lovely, wonderful thoughts that Peter Pan promised were actually just a massive distraction. While the world was telling me to smile, I was mesmerized by the quiet sadness you see in elderly faces, or the sting of scraped knuckles, and just the undeniable, sometimes horrifying reality of existence. The brutal truth of nature is that the lion definitely does not lie down with the lamb. That disconnect, that gap between the intense pressure to drink the Jubilee juice and the undeniable, often difficult reality of existence. That's what I call the happy complex. And honestly, I think forcing that smile might be doing us a lot more harm than good. Okay, so let's unpack this. That feeling of alienation, that sense of being a foreigner in the face of mandated cheerfulness, I think that's a serious indicator that something really fundamental has shifted in our culture. And we're not just talking about, choosing optimism or pessimism.
We're examining a much broader phenomenon where our collective ability to handle reality seems to be eroding in favor of a performative emotional state. Our mission for this deep dive is to really understand why forcing ourselves, and I think crucially forcing others, to be positive has transformed from what was a healthy ideal into this stringent cultural imperative. We need to analyze how this trend is isolating us and, maybe more dangerously, making us less capable of dealing with the complex, difficult world we actually live in.
That observation you had about the aggressively jubilant employee, that is a perfect starting point for drilling into this very modern anxiety. This shift isn't just a mood swing or some passing fad. What we're examining here is how the expectation of happiness has been systematically transformed from a private aspiration into what sociologists now recognize as a normative emotion, a cultural imperative. The demand for happiness has been upgraded to a moral duty.
A moral duty, so if you're not happy, you're somehow failing.
Exactly. If you fail to exhibit this required emotional regime, if you are visibly struggling or maybe just not performing joy, you are left in a state of what can only be called constant existential anxiety.
Yeah.
You start worrying about the danger of not being happy or not fitting into the required social script. We've moved so far beyond merely seeking personal fulfillment. Now we're demanding emotional performance. And that disconnect, that chasm between reality and requirement, is precisely what shatters authentic social cohesion. It just creates a vacuum of genuine interaction.
Okay, so if we want to understand how we got here, we have to look at the philosophical and sociological origins of this dramatic shift, right? We need to trace the precise moment when personal well-being and the pursuit of self-interest displaced collective commitment as the central defining goal of Western societies.
We can trace this trajectory back to the mid-20th century. A really good starting point is the sociologist Philip Rief's seminal 1966 work, The Triumph of the Therapeutic. Rief was one of the first to truly map this shift, the move from a culture rooted in shared faith and collective structures to one based primarily on, therapy and personal psychological maintenance. He identified the rise of the psychological man. This new person's quest for meaning was no longer anchored by transcendent structures like, say, organized religion or a strong national identity or shared moral codes. Instead, it centered entirely on individual fulfillment, personal freedom, and what he called impulse release.
Impulse release, so just acting on whatever you feel.
In a sense, yes. The goal became managing and freeing the self, not serving a community.
That's a fascinating pivot. Because if you look at previous centuries, the central purpose of existence was so often defined by external systems duty: God, nation, family. So when Rief saw this new psychological man emerging, Was he arguing that the purpose of life stopped being about serving something higher than the self and became purely about serving the self?
That is exactly Reef's core thesis, yes. He argued that the very definition of a stable, functioning culture lies in its interdictions and permissions.
Okay, what does he mean by that? Interdictions and permissions.
It's that complex, often invisible framework of rules which guides our behavior. It dictates right and wrong. And crucially, it helps people rein in our strongest and most urgent instincts, impulses, and desires. You can think of them as the guardrails of society. They keep things from flying off the rails.
Right, the things we all agree you just don't do, or the things you should do.
Exactly. And for past cultures, the motivation for restraining these desires, for accepting limits and finding meaning in struggle, came from a transcendent referent.
A transcendent referent. That's a big phrase.
It is. But the idea is simple. It's a grand collective commitment, a sacred idea that stands higher than the self. And Reef warned that if the shared framework vanished, individuals might believe they were free, but they would, in fact, be awash in anxiety, disconnection, and disease. They'd lack the internal and external resources, the cultural scaffolding needed to support them through their inner struggles. And this creates the exact Durkheimian anomie, a collapse of moral regulation that many argue we see today.
That philosophical displacement, moving from a shared collective goal to the individual, it must completely rewire how we communicate, how we resolve conflict. If we all agree the highest goal is my own personal fulfillment, how can we even begin to talk about shared duties or collective sacrifice or objective moral wrongs?
That is the crisis of communication that the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre addressed. He agreed that pursuing human purpose requires a coherent moral framework. You need a sense of the telos, which is the ultimate goal or purpose of a human life. And that necessarily involves shared concepts of what is good. MacIntyre argued that today we have lost that coherent structure entirely. Instead of shared principles, we are left relying on fragments. Little pieces inherited from past moral systems. We use the words, but the deep shared meaning is gone. The closest thing we have to a common language for moral judgment now is something he called emotivism.
Wait, okay, let's slow down on emotivism. That sounds like academic jargon, but it feels critical. What does emotivism mean in plain language?
It's the belief that all judgments about right, wrong, good, or bad are ultimately just expressions of personal preference.
Yeah.
So if I say it is wrong to cancel your friend and you say it is right to set a boundary and neither of us has a shared foundation for defining right or wrong outside of our own feelings, then we have no rational argument left.
So if I say X is right and you say Y is right, all we are actually saying is, I feel good about X and I feel good about Y. And there's just no way to bridge that gap with reason.
Precisely. Since no individual can appeal to a foundational principle that they share with others, there is no rational basis for solving disagreements. The only recourse becomes the manipulation of the feelings of other people. MacIntyre's conclusion was chilling. He said, emotivism entails the obliteration of any genuine distinction between manipulative and non-manipulative social relations.
Wow.
If all that matters is emotional preference and consensus, then society becomes a playground for raw power, for emotional blackmail, and for refined manipulative techniques. We lose the ability to trust the intentions behind someone's actions.
That feels like the inescapable manifestation of our culture today. A constant battle to generate outrage or sympathy rather than a debate over facts or principles. It's a rhetorical arms race, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where the person who feels the most or generates the most feeling wins the argument.
It is the inevitable manifestation of this deep cultural shift. And critics observe that the therapeutic sensibility didn't just stay isolated. Throughout the 20th century, it joined forces with consumerism. The ultimate expression of personal freedom became the ability to consume and pursue comfort. This powerful pairing validated and rewarded excessive self-concern, both self-regard and self-interest. And it actively encouraged extreme forms of emotional unleashing as long as that unleashing was in the pursuit of the self.
This preoccupation with the self must have fundamentally changed our institutions, not just our dinner table conversations.
It absolutely did. The sociologist James Nolan Jr. defined the resulting therapeutic ethos through 5 key components that really show how pervasive this mindset became. First, there's a pronounced cultural preoccupation with the individual self above all else. Second, a notable concern with the place of emotions in making sense of the world, which often gives feelings primacy over facts.
Feelings over facts.
Yes. Third, the emergence of a new class of professional counselors and psychologists who are socially recognized as the qualified guides for the emotion-laden self. The authority shifts from, say, the priest or the philosopher to the therapist. Fourth, the reinterpretation of a growing number of ordinary behaviors through pathological heuristics like addiction, disorder, and dysfunction. We start to label normal human struggles as illnesses. And finally, the unique cultural salience of the language of victimhood.
That language of victimhood is particularly damaging because once you adopt it, the burden of change immediately shifts onto the external world, not onto yourself. It requires everyone else to adjust for you.
And that leads to the final and perhaps most damaging consequence that critics note, a resulting condition of a loss of inwardness. This doesn't mean we stop looking at ourselves, quite the opposite. But the therapeutic approach systematically deprives individuals of the ability to develop their own efficacious approaches to outside circumstances.
Meaning the ability to build their own tools for handling tough situations.
Exactly. Instead of cultivating inner resources for resilience, the individual adopts an externalist vantage point. They begin to see the self only through the eyes of others, or through the lens of pop psychology, treating their internal life like a machine that constantly needs professional maintenance. The self becomes viewed as a problem to be solved, or a thing to be acted upon, leading inevitably to a deep sense of self-alienation and narcissism. The systematic derision of the individual's own ability to master the art of living is the ultimate cost of this therapeutic triumph.
So we have the philosophical groundwork laid out. The self is sacred, emotions are king, and we have no shared moral compass that transcends our personal feelings. The great promise of individual freedom was supposed to be liberating, yet it seems to have resulted in what we can only describe as an epidemic of disengagement and profound loneliness. This is the core irony, isn't it? How does the language of self-care, which sounds so healthy on the surface, turn into a justification for selfishness and lead to this kind of moral decay?
Because the therapeutic model, where the self is the absolute top priority, collides violently with the existing American cultural bedrock. In that bedrock, the self-made man is relentlessly valorized, and dependence is treated as a core personal failure. This collision creates what we call hyper-individualism, the sociological belief that everyone exists primarily as an atomized unit, responsible only for their own emotional portfolio.
But own emotional portfolio. That's a great phrase.
Concepts like self-care and protect your peace were originally intended as genuine tools for healing and for preventing burnout. But in the age of emotivism, they have been rebranded. They've become powerful moral justifications for retreating from connection, for shirking friends, and for avoiding fundamental responsibilities.
So instead of being a way to refuel so you can re-engage with the world, it becomes a permanent exit strategy.
Exactly. You start to see this transactional nature emerge in social interactions. Canceling plans with a friend becomes honoring our energy, which is really a form of self-sanctified retreat. Ghosting a friend, a profoundly isolating act that breaks a social contract, is excused as simply setting boundaries. This rebranding of detachment as strength allows people to just disappear from the social and communal networks that desperately count on them. They mistake independence for wholeness, and in doing so, they sacrifice real, messy connection for curated, predictable comfort.
That stands in such stark contrast to so much of the world. You look at cultures, whether they're Mediterranean, African, Asian, or Latin American, where the center of gravity is family and community. Their core understanding is deeply intuitive. Your well-being is intrinsically bound to the well-being of others. Our current model feels like it actively rejects that necessary human entanglement.
It rejects it. And in rejecting entanglement, it rejects the necessary friction of life. Real connection is not built on comfort. It is built on sacrifice and shared struggle. Authentic human experience requires friction, raising children, maintaining an old friendship that sometimes frustrates you, fighting for justice in your city. All of these require showing up when you're tired, listening when you'd rather talk, and compromising when you'd rather win.
Right.
Struggle is the vital ingredient. It is the crucible of character. Yet an entire modern ideology and economy have been built on the promise of freedom from having to struggle. This creates a culture where comfort becomes normalized and complacency sets in, and that leads directly to the collapse of common sense when difficult decisions are required.
And when comfort becomes the highest value, then laziness or even fear is easily repackaged as self-awareness. We lose the willingness to accept friction, and we're simultaneously losing the very experiences that build resilience and character. We're becoming profoundly fragile.
And this individual apathy has a catastrophic political price. The hyper-individualist belief that everyone is on their own translates seamlessly into a political reluctance to sacrifice for strangers. You see it when the reluctance to sacrifice personal time for friends translates into a reluctance to support social programs that require collective investment.
Like voting against affordable housing or infrastructure or universal health care.
Precisamente. This is often framed as pragmatic fiscal conservatism, but at its heart, it's the fundamental belief that community suffering is an individual problem, not a collective one.
Apathy, then, is poison to democracy and a catalyst for what some might call civilizational decline.
It is the ultimate breakdown of civic spirit. Alexis de Tocqueville, way back in the 1830s, detected the demon of hyper-individualism lurking in American egalitarianism. He warned that the political freedom promised by democracy was ironically bound to degrade social ties. He predicted that if an individual could gain enough wealth to look after their own needs, owing nothing to anybody, they would inevitably feel isolated, yet capable of molding their destiny alone.
And he saw that almost 200 years ago.
He did. Tocqueville predicted this condition would leave men shut up entirely within the solitude of his own heart, indifferent to the fate of others because they don't feel connected to their neighbors' destinies. When citizens stop believing their fates are tied together, they start participating in civic life. Democracy depends on people willing to act for the common good, not just for their own therapeutic maintenance. When self-protection becomes the highest national value, shared governance begins to crumble, and collective responsibility is replaced by mere consumer choice.
So we have to flip the script on self-care. It cannot be permission to hide. Rest should be preparation for participation, not avoidance of it. True freedom, real strength, comes through connection. The freedom to love, to struggle, and to belong to something messy and beautiful, not freedom from the demands of others. That's a fundamentally different moral project, isn't it? Okay, so if the happy complex means we are constantly suppressing negative emotions, doubt, fear, caution, even productive anger, what happens to our ability to see and respond rationally to the world around us? Especially in high-stakes environments like business or medicine or government. If we ignore complexity, we stop seeing reality.
The effects of unbalanced positivity, the overemphasis on optimism, and the active suppression or dismissal of negative data are deeply concerning because they lead to a profound distortion of reality. It's like navigating a heavily mined field blindfolded, relying purely on the internal feeling that everything will be fine. One immediate pitfall is the creation of unrealistic expectations. An overly optimistic outlook fuels a false sense of invulnerability. Psychologists call it the optimism bias, which means we systematically overestimate the likelihood of positive events and, tragically, underestimate the likelihood of negative ones. We think bad things only happen to other people.
Where do we see this optimism bias leading to catastrophic failures in the real world?
Oh, we have several striking historical and corporate examples. Consider the catastrophic downfall of Enron. Their executives weren't just incompetent, they were blinded by arrogance and an aggressive, excessive focus on a positive, continually upward outcome. They truly believed the company was too big to fail. This relentless positivity masked and enabled high-risk, unethical, and ultimately illegal accounting practices.
So the happy story covered up the crime.
Essentially. And on the political stage, think about the highly consequential planning that led up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. That military action was predicated on dangerously overly optimistic assumptions, that troops would be welcomed as liberators, that there was no need for comprehensive post-invasion planning, and that swift nation building was guaranteed. That whole tragedy demonstrates the perils of professional overconfidence and just ignoring the cautionary voices that warned of instability.
So the refusal to acknowledge complexity, or even the potential for failure, leads directly to bad decisions because you haven't prepared for anything other than the absolute best case scenario.
And it gets worse because unbalanced positivity also inevitably leads to the active dismissal of crucial warning signs. When individuals or institutions are fixated solely on positive outcomes, they become highly susceptible to confirmation bias.
They selectively filter out any incoming information that challenges their existing preferred positive narrative.
Exactly. They only hear what confirms their hope. In the corporate sphere, the Volkswagen emissions scandal is a textbook example. VW fostered an internal culture that was fixed on hitting these monumental growth and performance targets, using a language steeped in positivity and inevitability. This culture masked the underlying ethical breaches, the intentional programming of millions of diesel engines to cheat emissions tests for years. The fixation on the bright future of global market domination made it easy for countless people to ignore the dark reality of fraud happening right under their noses.
It also sounds like it contributes to a kind of moral slow creep, where small transgressions are allowed because the overall goal is seen as so positive.
That's the third critical pitfall, the normalization of deviance. Unbalanced positivity creates a slippery slope, where unethical or harmful behaviors gradually become accepted, provided they serve the overarching positive goal. The Wells Fargo account fraud scandal illustrates this dynamic perfectly. Employees were pushed by a high-pressure culture of positivity and aggressive sales targets. The relentless focus on meeting those targets, fueled by an unbalanced optimism about endless growth, completely masked the fact that employees were opening millions of unauthorized accounts. The illegal behavior eventually became systemic because the focus remained on the positive metric. More accounts open while ignoring the means used to achieve it. The moral integrity of the entire institution just eroded from the inside out in the name of performance.
This loss of critical thinking and erosion of integrity seems like a perfect recipe for a systemic breakdown, leading us toward something that resembles the satirical concept of idiocracy. A world where intelligence and expertise are actively filtered out.
That is exactly the cultural degradation we risk. Idiocracy depicts a society where critical thinking and rational discourse are entirely replaced by simplistic slogans and raw emotional reactivity. Nuance is stifled, expertise is devalued, and intellectual curiosity is seen as a liability. Unbalanced positivity accelerates this by demanding emotional uniformity and constantly discouraging engagement with complex, painful truths. When people become accustomed to simple, positive answers and are unwilling to engage with complexity, they become profoundly vulnerable to manipulation.
And that vulnerability creates a fertile ground for authoritarianism, which thrives on simple slogans and suppressing doubt.
Precisely. The erosion of critical thinking makes people susceptible to the appeal of simple, strong leaders who promise to fix complex problems instantly. They promise certainty and control in a chaotic world, and in turn, they violently suppress dissent and critical analysis in the name of a shared utopian vision. This mechanism isn't new. History shows that the allure of a utopian bright future, a world free from conflict or class struggle, has been cynically used to mobilize populations by totalitarian ideologies, including socialism, communism, and National Socialism.
The promise of the perfect future being used to justify the present horror.
Yes. By actively suppressing negative information and critical analysis, these regimes created an illusion of consensus and inevitability, paving the way for totalitarian nightmares. Stalin's purges, the Nazi genocide. It is a chilling reminder that hope and optimism must always be tempered with realism and critical thinking to safeguard democratic values. When an ideology demands you only look at the positive, you should be extremely wary of what it is forcing you to ignore.
When subjective emotion and mandated positivity dictate public discourse, we start seeing a disturbing trend in our institutions. Performance, or the ability to signal the correct emotional state, often supersedes objective competence and genuine principle. What happens when integrity gives way to mere performativity, especially in non-commercial environments like education or civic life?
We see the emergence of what is broadly termed performative activism or performative allyship. This is characterized as an inauthentic display of support for causes driven primarily by external motivation, the fear of social consequence, or the desire for social status, rather than a genuine internal commitment to egalitarian values.
So the motivation is key here. Is the action internally driven by belief, or is it externally driven by the fear of being canceled or excluded?
The difference is fundamental. Internal motivation stems from a personal commitment, while external motivation is a consequence of social pressures to conform. In a climate defined by external pressure, like the current rise of cancel culture, which collectively penalizes individuals who question socially accepted norms, people engage in performative behaviors simply to avoid ostracism or negative punishment.
This is a massive sociological phenomenon. It sounds very connected to the psychological concept of groupthink, but on a societal scale.
It is the global manifestation of groupthink, amplified and accelerated by social media. Irving Yannis, who coined the term, described groupthink as a collective adherence to specific perceptions or opinions that depict the perceived group consensus without any form of critical reflection or rationale. When the group demands a high level of agreeability, the risk is that self-reliant critical thought will be replaced by mere group consensus, and that often leads to irrational and even dehumanizing conduct towards anyone who dissents or fails to perform the correct emotion.
We can see this conflict between educational realism and mandated emotional comfort playing out acutely in our schools. I recall the anecdote about Arthur, the high school history teacher. Right? Arthur is a veteran teacher in a wealthy suburb who gave a student a C on an essay because it lacked rigor, was factually incorrect, and showed little effort. He saw the low grade as a necessary scraped knuckle, a dose of reality needed to build competence and resilience. But the parents were not interested in the facts or the need for rigor. They weaponized therapeutic language, arguing that the negative feedback itself was causing the student extreme anxiety and damaging their self-esteem, and they demanded the grade be raised.
That case perfectly encapsulates the pressure on institutions to become custodians of emotions, rather than guardians of objective standards. The parents demanded the grade be raised not because the work improved, but because the feeling of failure was deemed unacceptable. If obstacles are automatically redefined as trauma rather than as necessary lessons or friction points, the students are systematically robbed of the ability to build resilience and grow from struggle. The system is choosing comfort over character.
This culture of emotional performance is also highly visible when we look at issues of race and social justice. We have clear examples of external displays of allyship that seem to serve the performer's psychological need for virtue more than the material needs of the disadvantaged group.
The racial landscape provides a very sharp lens to see how performative behaviors function to manage the advantaged group's self-image. Consider a place like Portland, Oregon. Outwardly, it is seen as an oasis of progressive, conscientious culture. Yet it is deeply rooted in a history of racial injustice, including Black exclusion laws that were actively on the books until 2001 and ongoing unchecked gentrification that has displaced its original Black residents.
The contradiction between the outward display of virtue and the rooted systemic history is jarring.
It leads to the argument that the visible display of Black Lives Matter signs on lawns or the ritual of posting Black squares on social media can function as an external, performative action driven by white guilt. This behavior attempts to immediately restore a virtuous image for the advantaged group and provides escapism from the negative emotions associated with acknowledging real, ongoing racially motivated crimes. Crucially, it avoids confronting internal, systemic issues like white silence. These are often the easiest and most convenient public actions, visible to the public eye, but demanding no actual sacrifice or complex behavioral change.
But does this performative support actually hurt the disadvantaged groups it claims to help? Does it cause measurable harm?
Yes, studies indicate that it does. Disadvantaged groups are highly skilled at uncovering feigned or inauthentic support, which, when detected, leads to chronic stress and impacts their overall well-being. Furthermore, there's evidence that when activist groups are led predominantly by advantaged members, they are often less successful.
Why is that?
Because the advantaged members frequently prioritize having their voices heard and validating their emotional journey over centering the material needs and strategy of the disadvantaged. Superficial acts of allyship can exploit suffering like surrounding Black death and grief with signs and symbols that are ultimately viewed as an exploitation of Black suffering to demonstrate the allies' virtue.
The stakes are exponentially higher in high-competence fields like medicine, where realism must absolutely trump narrative. The focus has to be on objective success metrics. Let's look at the fascinating and deeply troubling scenario concerning the hiring of a senior medical leader, the story of Dr. Malik. So Dr. Malik, a senior surgeon with decades of experience, sat on a hiring panel for a critical department head role. The decision came down to two candidates. Candidate A had the clearly superior meritocratic reality, a spotless track record, more published research, and high surgical success rates over a long career. Candidate B had a decent record, but their interview focused heavily on their ability to promote inclusive joy and narrative within the team, emphasizing emotional performance. Malik argued that in a cardiac unit, competence is paramount. The only inclusivity that truly matters is the inclusion of a beating heart at the end of the procedure. But he was overruled. The institution consciously chose emotional performance and narrative over the meritocratic reality. Malik felt a profound collapse of common sense, realizing that the institution broke its fundamental contract with patients by suppressing genuine, objective realism to serve as a preferred social narrative.
This fear of the collapse of common sense is magnified by documented instances of ideological capture in the medical field, where data and established protocol were consciously overridden in favor of ideological goals, even when those goals were projected to cost lives. Take the decision by the CEC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices ACP regarding vaccine rationing in late 2020. People over 65 were undeniably the single highest risk group for severe COVID morbidity and mortality, and almost every country in the world prioritized them for the initial vaccine rollout. Yet, ACIP initially decided not to prioritize age.
Why? Why would you reject the most obvious data-driven metric for saving lives, which is age?
Because the over 65 cohort in America was proportionally whiter than the general population, the committee explicitly invoked this fact, framing their decision as a necessary move to compensate for historical injustices. They called this the equity approach, prioritizing essential workers over seniors, figuring that minority groups would be overrepresented in the essential worker cohort and thus receive vaccines first. This was a clear example of using racial politics as the primary method for rationing scarce medical resources, overriding established public health mandates.
And what was the outcome of this decision, based on their own internal analysis?
The outcome was shocking. ACIP did its own mathematical calculation and found that this equity approach would cause between 0.5% and 6.5% more deaths overall in the American population compared to prioritizing the elderly. Despite this explicit calculation that the ideological choice would result in higher total mortality, the decision was defended in the name of compensatory justice.
Unbelievable.
This highlights the immense danger of prioritizing a social narrative over a strictly public health mandate. The public outcry was so significant that ACP ultimately reversed its plan to align with standard age-based practice.
The concern about maintaining objective standards extends into medical education, too, where the focus on excellence seems to be bending to emotional and social goals.
It does. The pursuit of diversity goals has generated concerns about the maintenance of standards of excellence necessary for such a high-stakes profession. For example, data shows that minority students with middling grades and entrance exam scores are up to 4 times more likely to be admitted to medical school than their white and Asian counterparts with comparable scores. This suggests a systemic preference for narrative diversity over traditional academic merit. Furthermore, the National Board of Medical Examiners changed the Step 1 exam, a critical, comprehensive 7-hour medical licensing test, from a numeric score to a simple pass-fail designation. The stated reason was not just to reduce stress on students, but also explicitly to account for known group differences in performance. This move, many argue, lowers the bar for professional standards in a field where excellence is literally life and death.
And finally, we need to address the controversy surrounding the neonate study, which seemed to show that a doctor's race was the key factor in infant mortality. This was seized upon by institutions to defend race-based admissions and hiring.
That study, published in 2020, it garnered massive attention for reporting that the mortality rate of Black newborns was cut in half when they were treated by Black doctors. The implication was stark and powerful. Black babies should be treated by Black doctors. It certainly fed directly into the narrative of pervasive systemic racism within the medical profession that only identity could cure.
But what did the subsequent, more thorough reanalysis show about this seemingly objective finding?
The initial study authors had controlled for nearly 70 variables, which sounds exhaustive, but they crucially omitted the single biggest risk factor for newborn health: low birth weight. When the data was reanalyzed years later, the picture changed dramatically. Black newborns were statistically much more likely to be in the low birth weight category, meaning they required immediate intensive care in the neonatal intensive care unit, the NICU. And since most neonatologists in this country are white, these severely ill Black babies were, by statistical necessity, more likely to be treated by white doctors, and tragically more likely to die due to the gravity of their underlying illness. The doctor's race was, in the end, statistically irrelevant to the outcome. The severity of the infant's underlying illness, driven by low birth weight, was a relevant factor. This corrective emphasizes the immense danger that arises when narrative and social signaling are prioritized over sound scientific methodology and complete data in high-stakes environments. What we have seen, then, is that the relentless pressure to adhere to the happy complex and to be positive, paradoxically, results in self-alienation and profound social isolation. The therapeutic culture tells us to look inward for fulfillment, but the hyper-individualist model simultaneously forces us to manage our outer self, our public performance, as the most visible and valuable part of our identity. This relentless focus on external identification and compliance with emotional norms, whether it's performing joy in a service job or displaying performative allyship or seeking inclusive joy over competence in a medical setting, it leads directly to a loss of authenticity. It fatally erodes our ability to distinguish genuine merit from mere virtue signaling, and this leaves us fragile and vulnerable to sophisticated manipulation.
The complexity of existence, the blend of the horrifying and the beautiful, the scraped knuckles and the moments of profound connection. It's absolutely inescapable. True resilience is not born from having obstacles removed or reality denied. It's built through accepting struggle and being present for others, especially when the reality is painful and requires sacrifice. If we continue to prioritize external identification and emotional performance over genuine self-reflection and objective competence, we risk a pervasive societal fragility that will ultimately consume our most vital institutions. We have to find a way to honor our full spectrum of emotions without allowing them to dictate and ultimately override our collective ability to perceive and respond to the truth of reality.